When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was convicted in 1952 for conspiracy to sell heroin and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, federal law enforcement celebrated what they believed was a decisive victory against Harlem's most powerful criminal operator. Johnson had controlled gambling operations, provided protection services, mediated disputes, and functioned as an unofficial power structure in Harlem for nearly 3 decades. Putting him in prison, especially in Alcatraz, specifically designed to isolate high-profile criminals from their organizations, should have ended his influence and exposed his assets. That's how it always worked. Crime bosses need direct control. They need to give orders, collect money, enforce discipline, respond to threats. Take away their freedom, isolate them on an island prison with restricted communication and minimal visitation, and their organizations fracture. Associates fight over territory. Money flows become visible as people scramble to secure assets. Weaknesses emerge that investigators can exploit. The FBI and IRS had seen this pattern repeatedly. Al Capone's organization had crumbled during his imprisonment. Dutch Schultz's operations had dissolved after his elimination. Organized crime required active leadership, and imprisonment effectively removed that leadership. So when Johnson was transferred to Alcatraz in 1954, designated as inmate number 117, placed under the prison's regime of extreme isolation and controlled communication designed specifically to prevent inmates from coordinating outside criminal activities, federal investigators expected his Harlem empire to begin collapsing within months. By 1956, 2 years into Johnson's Alcatraz sentence, investigators were confused. Nothing was collapsing. Gambling operations in Harlem continued functioning smoothly. Protection services remained organized. Community respect for Johnson hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown. And most frustratingly, Johnson's money remained completely invisible. This shouldn't have been possible. Imprisoned crime bosses lose control. Their associates betray them or incompetently mismanage operations. Their assets become exposed as people fight over inheritance. The organization deteriorates in ways that create investigative opportunities. But Johnson's organization showed no signs of deterioration. No internal conflicts, no exposed assets, no opportunities. That's when Special Agent Robert Morrison was assigned to lead a federal task force with one specific objective: follow the money, find Johnson's assets, seize them before he was released, prove that crime doesn't pay by ensuring that when Johnson eventually walked out of Alcatraz, he'd walk out broke, powerless, and irrelevant. Morrison was given extensive resources: IRS forensic accountants, federal surveillance teams, authority to pressure witnesses, coordination with local law enforcement. Everything needed to trace money flows from Harlem's illegal economy and identify where Johnson had hidden his wealth. The timeline was simple. Johnson wouldn't be eligible for parole until at least 1963. That gave Morrison 7 years to dismantle Johnson's financial empire, while Johnson sat powerless in prison, unable to interfere, unable to move assets, unable to protect what federal investigators would uncover. 7 years should have been more than enough time. It wasn't. Morrison's investigation began with what should have been the easiest target: identifying Johnson's assets accumulated over 3 decades of criminal enterprise. Numbers gambling alone would have generated substantial wealth. Protection services, mediation fees, various legitimate business interests. Johnson should have been rich, and that wealth should have been traceable. The IRS team assigned to Morrison started with standard financial investigation: property records, business ownership filings, bank accounts, investment portfolios, anything that would indicate wealth accumulation. They searched under Johnson's name, under family members' names, under known associates' names. They found almost nothing. No significant property holdings in Johnson's name. No substantial bank accounts, no investment portfolios, no obvious assets that would suggest 3 decades of profitable criminal enterprise. It's like he lived day to day with no savings. One IRS investigator told Morrison during an early briefing, either he spent everything immediately, which doesn't match informant reports about his lifestyle, or he moved money in ways we can't trace. Morrison authorized deeper investigation. The IRS team expanded their search to include shell companies, nominee ownership arrangements, offshore accounts, all the standard methods criminals use to hide wealth. Still nothing that could be definitively connected to Johnson. He's either the poorest successful criminal in history, another investigator said, or he's structured his finances in ways we've never encountered before. Morrison began interviewing people in Harlem, asking about Johnson's wealth, about where money went, about who controlled his interests while he was imprisoned. The answers he received were frustratingly consistent and vague. Bumpy helped people, one community leader said. If someone needed rent money, he'd help. If a business needed startup capital, he'd help. If a family had an emergency, he'd help. But I never saw him accumulate wealth. He was rich, but the money always seemed to be moving rather than sitting still. This pattern repeated across dozens of interviews. Johnson had money. Johnson used money to help people, support businesses, maintain influence. But nobody could point to specific accounts or properties or investments where that money pooled. The money was flowing, but it wasn't accumulating anywhere investigators could identify. He's treating wealth like water, Morrison told his team. It flows through his hands to other people, disperses throughout Harlem, and disappears into 1,000 small transactions that are impossible to trace back to source. And he structured it this way deliberately, knowing that someday we'd come looking for assets to seize. The investigation expanded to Johnson's associates, people who'd worked with him, people who might be holding assets on his behalf while he was imprisoned. Federal agents interviewed dozens of individuals, pressuring them to reveal hidden wealth, offering immunity in exchange for cooperation. Nobody had information that could locate Johnson's money. "You think Bumpy was dumb enough to tell people where he kept his money?" one former associate said when questioned. "You think he trusted anyone enough to make them rich while he was locked up? He's smarter than that. Whatever money he had, it's hidden in ways nobody knows except him." But that created another puzzle. If Johnson had hidden substantial wealth, if only he knew where it was, how was his organization still functioning? Criminal enterprises require capital to operate. Where was the money coming from to maintain operations while Johnson sat in Alcatraz, unable to access or transfer funds? Morrison realized the uncomfortable truth. Johnson's organization wasn't running on hidden capital. It was generating new revenue, continuing to operate profitably, functioning as a self-sustaining enterprise that didn't require Johnson's active management or access to accumulated wealth. This violated everything federal investigators understood about how criminal organizations worked. Crime bosses were supposed to be irreplaceable. Their imprisonment was supposed to create power vacuums. Operations were supposed to collapse without direct leadership. Johnson had somehow built an organization that continued functioning perfectly without him. By 1960, 6 years into Johnson's imprisonment, Morrison's investigation had failed to locate significant assets and had generated no evidence that Johnson's organization was weakening. If anything, Harlem's illegal economy appeared more stable than ever, more resistant to external pressure, more professionally managed. Morrison's supervisor at FBI headquarters demanded new approaches. If financial investigation couldn't locate hidden wealth, if Johnson's organization showed no vulnerabilities, then federal agencies needed to apply direct pressure that would force mistakes, expose weaknesses, create opportunities for asset seizure. The escalation campaign began in early 1960. IRS initiated comprehensive audits on every business in Harlem suspected of any connection to Johnson's interests. Restaurants, social clubs, real estate offices, legitimate businesses that might be fronts for illegal activity or might be holding assets on Johnson's behalf. The goal was to create financial pressure that would reveal hidden money or force people into cooperation. The audits revealed minor tax discrepancies that were corrected with small penalties. They revealed no hidden wealth. They exposed no criminal enterprise. They created enormous inconvenience and expense for Harlem businesses, but produced no evidence that would advance the investigation. FBI increased surveillance on people suspected of managing Johnson's interests during his imprisonment, documenting their movements, their meetings, their activities. The goal was to identify who was actually running operations, who had access to money, who could be pressured into revealing where assets were hidden. The surveillance produced thousands of pages of reports documenting completely legal activities. People met at restaurants. People attended community events. People conducted normal business. Nothing observed violated laws or suggested access to hidden criminal wealth. Federal prosecutors began approaching former Johnson associates with immunity offers, testify about his hidden assets, reveal where money was hidden, cooperate in exchange for protection from prosecution. Nobody accepted these offers, not because they were fiercely loyal, though some were, but because they genuinely didn't know where Johnson's money was. He'd never trusted anyone enough to make them wealthy caretakers during his imprisonment. The most aggressive pressure came in 1962, when federal agents began overtly contacting businesses in Harlem, informing them that they were suspected of being involved in Johnson's criminal enterprise, that cooperation with investigators would be viewed favorably, while continued association with Johnson would result in legal consequences. This tactic had worked in previous organized crime investigations, fracturing loyalty through fear of prosecution. In Harlem, it backfired completely. Businesses that were contacted by federal agents became more protective of Johnson, more resistant to cooperation. The community perceived federal pressure not as legitimate law enforcement, but as harassment of a respected community figure who'd helped people while government ignored them. Morrison watched this backfire in real time and understood something important. Johnson's power in Harlem wasn't based primarily on fear or criminal enterprise. It was based on respect, on reciprocity, on decades of actually providing services and protection that government didn't provide. Pressure from federal agents couldn't fracture that kind of loyalty because it wasn't transactional, it was relational. By mid-1963, 7 years into Morrison's investigation, federal agencies had spent approximately $200,000 in resources trying to locate and seize Johnson's assets while he sat imprisoned in Alcatraz, unable to interfere with their investigation, unable to move money or hide wealth in response to federal pressure. They'd found nothing they could seize. They'd identified no vulnerabilities they could exploit. They'd produced no evidence that would extend Johnson's imprisonment or prevent him from returning to power upon release. And Johnson's release was imminent. He'd been granted parole, scheduled for August 13, 1963. Federal investigators had 7 years of unrestricted access to investigate someone who couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't interfere. And they'd accomplished nothing except learning that Bumpy Johnson was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. 1 month before Johnson's scheduled release, Morrison received a report from an informant who'd served time in Alcatraz alongside Johnson. The informant hadn't been cultivated. He'd approached federal agents voluntarily after his own release, wanting to provide information in exchange for help with parole conditions. "You want to know about Bumpy?" the informant said during debriefing. "He's the smartest guy I ever met in prison. Smarter than the gangsters, smarter than the con artists, probably smarter than half the guards. You know what he did while everyone else was complaining or planning escapes or going crazy from isolation?" Morrison waited. He read everything he could get his hands on: law books, business books, history, economics, philosophy, and he thought. He'd sit in his cell and think for hours about systems, about how organizations work, about how to structure things so they keep running when you're not there to run them. The informant continued. Other guys in Alcatraz, they were worried about their operations falling apart while they were locked up, worried about people stealing from them, betraying them, taking over. Bumpy never worried, never even talked about it, like he knew everything was handled, like he'd already solved that problem before he ever got arrested. This insight unlocked Morrison's understanding of what made Johnson different from every other criminal he'd investigated. Johnson hadn't built a criminal empire that depended on him. He'd built systems that functioned without him. He'd created structures where loyalty was based on mutual benefit rather than fear. He had dispersed wealth rather than accumulating it because dispersed wealth couldn't be seized. He'd maintained influence through reputation and reciprocity rather than through direct control. Most importantly, he'd done all of this before he was imprisoned, preparing for the possibility that someday federal law enforcement would try exactly what Morrison had tried: isolate him, seize his assets, dismantle his organization. Johnson had anticipated that scenario and had structured everything to resist it. "He told me something once, the informant said. We were talking about guys who got released from prison broke because feds seized everything while they were locked up. And Bumpy said, only stupid criminals keep their money where government can find it. Smart criminals understand that wealth is relationships, not assets. You can't seize relationships, you can't audit trust, and you can't imprison influence that's built on actually helping people." Morrison sat with this information, understanding that it explained everything his investigation had failed to accomplish. Johnson's wealth wasn't hidden in offshore accounts or shell companies or nominee arrangements. It was dispersed throughout Harlem in the form of helped businesses, paid rents, supported families, created goodwill. That wealth couldn't be seized because it wasn't concentrated. It couldn't be traced because it existed as 1,000 small transactions across a decade. And it couldn't be eliminated because it had been converted from money into loyalty, from assets into influence. And that influence had kept his organization functioning while he was imprisoned. People ran operations not because Johnson was giving orders from Alcatraz, which was impossible under the prison's communication restrictions, but because they understood how the system worked, because they benefited from keeping it functioning, because they respected what Johnson had built. Federal imprisonment worked against criminals who maintained power through fear and direct control. It didn't work against someone who'd built power through systems and relationships that functioned independently. Morrison wrote an assessment that he knew would never be officially filed. Subject Johnson demonstrates organizational intelligence that exceeds institutional capability to counter. Standard investigative methods, ineffective. Subject structured operations, specifically to resist federal pressure and asset seizure. Imprisonment did not neutralize subject's influence. Recommend acknowledging limitations of conventional approaches when facing this level of sophistication. Morrison stood 3 blocks from the Teresa Hotel on 125th Street, watching thousands of Harlem residents gather to welcome Bumpy Johnson home from Alcatraz. The celebration had been spontaneous. No formal organization, no announced time, just people who'd heard Johnson was being released and wanted to be there when he returned. This wasn't how imprisoned crime bosses were supposed to be greeted. This was how war heroes were greeted, how beloved leaders were greeted. Morrison watched Johnson emerge from a vehicle looking older than his 57 years, wearing a modest suit, walking with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent 11 years in maximum security prison. The crowd erupted in cheers. People reached out to shake his hand, to welcome him, to tell him they'd missed him, and Johnson smiled. Not the smile of someone who'd lost 11 years of his life to federal imprisonment. The smile of someone who'd just proven that imprisonment couldn't break what he'd built. Morrison understood in that moment that every assumption federal law enforcement had made about Bumpy Johnson had been wrong. They'd assumed he was a typical crime boss who could be neutralized through incarceration. They'd assumed his wealth could be seized through investigation. They'd assumed his organization would fracture without his direct leadership. All of those assumptions had been proven false. Johnson wasn't typical. His wealth couldn't be seized because it had been converted into influence. His organization hadn't fractured because it was built on systems rather than personality. Federal law enforcement had spent 7 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to dismantle Bumpy Johnson's empire while he sat in Alcatraz, unable to interfere. And they'd failed, completely. Not because Johnson was lucky, not because he'd corrupted investigators, not because federal agencies were incompetent, but because Johnson was smarter, because he'd understood how the system worked and had structured everything to exploit its weaknesses, because he'd anticipated federal pressure and had prepared defenses before that pressure materialized, because he'd built something that couldn't be dismantled using conventional methods. Morrison returned to his office and wrote the final report that would officially close the investigation into Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson's assets. Investigation conducted 1956 to 1963 while subject incarcerated at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Objective: locate and seize assets accumulated through criminal enterprise. Result: no significant assets identified, no evidence of hidden wealth accessible to federal seizure. Subject's organization continued functioning during imprisonment without visible leadership or accessible capital. Conclusion: subject demonstrates sophisticated organizational structure resistant to standard asset recovery methods. Case closed. Subject released from custody August 13, 1963. No prosecutable violations identified during investigation. What Morrison didn't include in his official report, what he documented only in personal notes that would never become part of FBI records, was his actual conclusion. Subject Johnson is the most intelligent criminal operator this agent has encountered in 20 years of federal law enforcement. He built an organization that functioned perfectly during 11 years of his maximum security imprisonment. He structured finances in ways that made his wealth invisible to intensive federal investigation. He maintained community influence from inside Alcatraz without communication or direct control. He defeated every attempt to dismantle his empire simply by being smarter than the institutions trying to dismantle it. This represents a fundamental challenge to assumptions about how organized crime can be countered through incarceration and asset seizure. The Bumpy Johnson investigation didn't end FBI interest in him. Surveillance continued after his release. Agents documented his return to Harlem, his reestablishment of influence, his activities during the 5 years between his release and his death in 1968. But the nature of that surveillance changed. No longer did federal law enforcement treat Johnson as a target who could be pressured into mistakes or whose organization could be dismantled through conventional investigation. Instead, they treated him as something unprecedented, a criminal operator whose intelligence exceeded institutional capability to counter through standard methods. Within FBI culture, among agents who worked organized crime investigations, the Johnson case became a teaching example, not of success, but of failure that taught important lessons about limitations of institutional power when facing exceptional individual intelligence. Morrison himself, who eventually became an assistant director overseeing organized crime nationwide, would reference the Johnson case in training for new agents. Most criminals are reactive. They commit crimes, we investigate, they try to avoid detection, we apply pressure, they make mistakes, we prosecute. It's a cycle that works because criminals are typically less sophisticated than institutions pursuing them. But occasionally you encounter someone who's studied the system so deeply that they can exploit institutional weaknesses we didn't know existed. Someone who structures their operations specifically to resist our methods. Someone who understands that influence based on helping people can't be seized the way bank accounts can be seized. Those individuals can't be defeated through conventional investigation. They require patience. They require waiting for circumstances to change. And most importantly, they require respect for their capabilities. The financial investigators from IRS, who'd spent years trying to trace Johnson's money, used that failure to develop new analytical frameworks for understanding how wealth could be dispersed rather than accumulated, how criminal proceeds could be converted into influence rather than hoarded as assets, how some criminal organizations operated on completely different economic models than standard accumulation and luxury spending that created traceable evidence. For local law enforcement in Harlem, the Johnson case confirmed what they'd already understood from street experience, that some community leaders operated outside legal structures not just for personal profit, but because they provided services and stability that official government wouldn't provide, and that those individuals maintained power through community respect rather than through fear alone, making them fundamentally different from typical criminals who could be isolated and prosecuted. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the investigation's failure was what it revealed about the limits of incarceration as a tool for neutralizing criminal power. Federal law enforcement had assumed that putting someone in Alcatraz, America's most secure, most isolating prison, would effectively end their influence and expose their assets. That assumption worked for most criminals who depended on direct control and whose organizations fractured during their imprisonment. It didn't work for Bumpy Johnson because he'd built something different, something that didn't require his presence to function, something that converted wealth into loyalty and assets into relationships and concentrated power into dispersed systems that couldn't be seized or dismantled. 11 years in Alcatraz didn't break that structure. Federal investigation during those 11 years didn't locate hidden wealth. Pressure campaigns didn't fracture loyalty. Johnson walked out of prison in 1963 to a parade of thousands, re-established his influence immediately, continued operating until his death 5 years later, and never faced prosecution for activities federal agents were certain he was conducting. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's intelligence that federal institutions weren't equipped to counter. Years after Johnson's death in 1968, Morrison would occasionally reflect on the case that had taught him the most important lesson of his career, that institutional power has limits, that some individuals possess capabilities that transcend normal categories, and that recognizing superior intelligence is sometimes more valuable than pretending conventional methods will eventually work. Bumpy Johnson was one of those individuals. He proved that a man in Alcatraz could be more powerful than federal agents on the streets if that man had built systems smart enough to function without him. He demonstrated that wealth converted into influence was more durable than wealth accumulated in accounts. He showed that loyalty based on actually helping people was stronger than fear-based control. And he did all of it while sitting in a prison cell, unable to give orders, unable to move money, unable to do anything except trust that the systems he'd built before his arrest would continue working. They did, for 11 years, perfectly. That's the kind of intelligence that institutions struggle to defeat, the kind that operates outside expected patterns, the kind that anticipates institutional responses and prepares counters before attacks come. Morrison kept his personal assessment of the Johnson investigation filed away, and decades later, when teaching new agents about sophisticated criminal operators, he would reference it. Bumpy Johnson spent 11 years in Alcatraz. During that time, we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to seize his assets and dismantle his organization. We found nothing we could seize. We identified no vulnerabilities we could exploit. We accomplished nothing except learning that imprisonment doesn't neutralize intelligence. It only tests it. And Bumpy Johnson passed that test in ways that proved he was smarter than every system designed to beat him. That was the real lesson. Not that Bumpy Johnson was invincible. No one is invincible. But that he understood power well enough to maintain it from inside a prison cell. Understood systems well enough to build structures that functioned without him. Understood his enemies well enough to defeat them without appearing to fight them. When Johnson died in 1968, federal investigators knew more about him than they'd known in 1952 when he was first imprisoned. They knew he was sophisticated. They knew he was intelligent. They knew he'd built something that conventional law enforcement couldn't dismantle. What they never knew was where his money went, how much he'd accumulated, whether he died wealthy or broke, because that information, like so much about Bumpy Johnson, remained hidden in plain sight, dispersed throughout Harlem in the form of paid rents and supported businesses, and helped families and created loyalty that outlasted imprisonment, investigation, and even death. That's intelligence. That's sophistication. That's the kind of mind that federal institutions, despite all their resources and authority and investigative power, sometimes simply can't defeat. And recognizing that truth, uncomfortable as it was for federal law enforcement, was more important than continuing to waste resources on investigations that would never succeed against someone who'd proven himself smarter than the system trying to catch him.